And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, we enter 2025 through a glass darkly, as it were, but with a new episode. Tonight, it's Dark Journalist X-Series episode 183, the TUAOI Atlantis Firestone Crystal in the HotZone. This is going to be something special. As we come into the episode, there's all this breaking news, of course, about the Las Vegas bombing and this very interesting case of this individual who blew themselves up in a Tesla truck, apparently. The details there are very scattered, but some things came to light today, and we'll get into those. We'll cover them in kind of the opening here. But before we get into all that, and the craziness in the world, along with the fact that Mike, our friend there, Speaker Johnson, is back in, and that Liz Cheney got the Lifetime Achievement Medal from President Biden. That's great. Isn't that great? COG on display, just on parade, as it were. But there are a couple of interesting things there. And, of course, we did a series of episodes at the end of the year about COG Northcom and the whole drone swarm and how that relates to emergency powers. It's very interesting with some of the things that are coming out. Again, this crisscross around the drone swarm aspect and the death of this whistleblower who was coming forward with information. Apparently, we don't even know if that was him in the vehicle at this point, but it is very interesting. There's a crisscross now with some emails that he sent just before he, supposedly committed suicide in this explosion, or actually shot himself in the head and detonated the explosion. There's a lot of very big unanswered questions with this one, but we will get into it. Of course, that is the case of Matthew Livelsberger, and he shot himself in the head before the explosion. Doesn't make sense. That's the headline on this one. It really hangs out there. But one of the very odd things is in these series of emails that he was sending to a retired intelligence official who went on a big podcast today, Sean Ryan podcast, and exposed all these details. I'll read his messages. But one of the interesting things that came up in relation to all this is that he was referencing the drone warfare that was taking place and the intimidation tactics and where it was coming from and who was behind it, etc. One of the things that I think is very left out of the conversation, and it shows, of course, we know that the mainstream media is, they're not going to give you the real facts. They're going to give you the official story. But the independent media also has really fell down on the job with the drone swarm part. They got uncomfortable. It was outside of their wheel of expertise, and they were just like, oh, people are just making it up. No, the skies have been crowded, and they continue to be crowded with hundreds of unaccounted for drones. And we're entering into a totally new era with this, which is something that we've been talking about on this program for a while. So one of the things I want to start off the year with on this is that you have to get the connection between COG Northcom exercises that were going on called Operation Homeland Synchronizer and all the drone activity that came on as a huge surge after the fact. So you have to put those two together if you're going to get anywhere. Northcom is left out because people don't understand the impact of Northcom. Well, Northcom was created after the events of 9/11, created under emergency conditions, and maintains the ability to take over the homeland. That's what they refer to the United States as. So we have to keep that right in the center of things. It gets lost. Everyone wants to talk about these sort of little silos of things that go on, and they keep missing the target on this one. The target is Northcom. Northcom is the source of the drone aspect. You have to get your head wrapped around that. And then there might be intersecting factors. There might be buffering. There may be war games involved, whatever it happens to be. But how is this getting missed? We put it out there, And so I want to really emphasize that as we start the year off, because otherwise we're going to be lost in this mystery going along right into 2025 up to the inauguration, and Northcom is going to be missed out of the conversation. I want to give you just a couple of things on that, and then we'll get a little bit into this whole situation with Livelsberger. And I want to say also that, it's very important with the drone piece that, as I mentioned, the independent media dropped the ball in one regard, is that they didn't know what to do with it. So they were like, hey, it's nothing. And you had some really kind of big names saying, oh, it's misidentified aircraft. People are in a frenzy. No, it wasn't. There were thousands of drones over the U.S. airspace, and there still are. And they stopped reporting on it, and the mainstream media is delighted. And, there's a kind of zombie factor in the independent media. And I've said this before, when you crowded in the mainstream sources who had been bought and paid for decades by, Fox and CNN and all that, and then they come into the independent media space, they dumb down the entire environment. But they still have large numbers because they have the big name recognition and all the rest. So you have to, in 2025, one of the great things that we need to do is find that potency in reporting and in the stories, and find the sourcing for the stories. Famously, in this case, the Sean Ryan had put out, based on his interviewee's testimony, these emails that Livelsberger had put out there. And it's interesting because people were grabbing the snapshot. Some big accounts grabbed the snapshot and just ran with it like it was their own. This is a big problem. And there's a huge plagiarism that goes on in independent media for clicks and for, tweets and X points and ad revenue, whatever it happens to be. You're going to have to separate heavily between what is actually media, what's potent media, and the kind of work we try to do in this program versus this other stuff, which we're surrounded by, a kind of a marketing fluff overflow. And a lot of it is junk conspiracy. That the more we deal with that, the better we're going to be able to get to the core of the real deal. But here's a little piece to keep in mind when the drone thing comes in and people don't have the right explanations for it. Okay, this story now comes to us from right before the drone warfare hit. Northcom head wants new integration role in counter UAS, unmanned aerial systems, ops. General Gregory Gio, who is the COG combatant commander. If they flip the COG switch, of course, he becomes the dictator of the United States and appoints regional governors. Gio told the annual symposium that he also believes the U.S. military needs to increase its efforts to field directed energy weapons to counter uncrewed aircraft systems and cruise hypersonic missiles. So he was asking for all this stuff just before the drones. That has to be key. He did major meetings, and then he held a series of drills. And the drills were UAP versus UAS systems, these drone systems. So then all the actual sightings start to happen as soon as the drill is over. And this goes deep into the type of reporting that we do in this program, which is deep events very often follow on from actual drills that are going on, and then they piggyback on top of the drill and they spray it wide. What happened in the case of 9/11, for example, is there were drills going on that morning, and the drills were Al-Qaeda flies terrorist airplanes into the Trade Center. That was the drill that was happening. And then the actual thing takes place on the day that they're doing the drill. Well, if you're setting up the drill, you have a number of things in place and all the rest, and then someone could just come in there and pirate that whole thing. That's what you're seeing with the drone thing as well. Northcom head wants new integration role. The key there is new, because Northcom doesn't deserve to have that role, but they want new powers. And the way that you get those new powers is to introduce a sky emergency, the drones, for example, and then Northcom assumes more powers. Now, the Northcom commander is also the NORAD commander, and he also is the COG combatant commander. He's a triple threat. That's the way that they've set him up. So this needs to be front and center in any conversation dealing with the drones, and the kind of deadheads in the independent media that are saying it was misidentification or whatever. That's all been proven out. Okay, we already know that there are thousands of unidentified drones up there. The question is, who do they belong to? and who was really pulling this surge. Now, they say, well, the surge eased up right around the holidays or whatever. Well, the reporting eased up considerably, yes. I'm not sure that the surge itself has. And I think with this bombing incident and the linkage to the New Jersey drone swarms, we're looking at things that are related here again. And it's going to be very important to know what's going on above us, the eye in the sky, as it were. This is going to be crucial. I'm going to read now Matthew Livelsberger, what he sent to Sean Ryan's guest before he showed up dead outside of Trump Tower in a Tesla vehicle. Now, this is a confirmed email, you know, on a number of different sources. So this is not a fly-by-night Reddit document, which is, you know, we're seeing so many of those that you have to know, where is this stuff coming from? You have to be able, some good old fundamental journalistic, you know, techniques, savvy techniques would really come in handy here, where you're being overloaded with ops. One of them is who, what, why. And, you know, let's get to it, which is, you know, where, first of all, what's the source of what you got and where's it coming from and who else can confirm it? Always start with that. Never run over a cliff based on somebody's tweet. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. But these are absolutely bona fide, and the person who received them confirmed them, and even law enforcement now has confirmed that these were sent by Matthew Livelsberger. Now, this is what he wrote. In case I do not make it to my decision point or onto the Mexico border, I'm sending this now. Please do not release this until January 1st. Keep my identity private until then. First off, I'm not under duress or hostile influence or control. My first car was a 2006 black Ford Mustang V6 for verification. What we've been seeing with drones, in quotes now, drones, is the operational use of gravitic propulsion systems, powered aircraft by most recently China in the East Coast, but throughout history, the U.S., only we and China have this capability. But OPCAN location for this activity is in the box below, operational center. Now, the box that is below, he put the spot right there in Groom Lake. That's Area 51 for where all this activity is coming from. That brings us into this whole conversation about the UFO file, et cetera, but I'll leave that for now. China's been launching them from the Atlantic from submarines for years, but this activity recently has picked up. As of now, it's just a show of force. They're using it similar to how they use the balloon for signal intelligence and ISR, which are also part of the integrated comm system. There are dozens of these balloons in the air at any given time. Here's the thing. The Chinese balloon, which happened in early 2023, and I'm saying this, I'm getting out of the quote here for unquote for a second. That whole thing that has never happened across the United States ever. Okay, since World War II, there have been solid things in place, and I've went and investigated the rules exactly around this. And you cannot fly a balloon from a foreign country into this country because the Japanese used them as poisonous balloons and actually killed people, although it wasn't widely reported at the time, by landing these big poisonous balloons off of the West Coast. So it happened in the Pacific Northwest. And we put in all these things in place so that that could never happen again. Now, that was before we had the Air Force or anything. And then we had the whole threat of ICBMs and everything else. This whole thing about, oh, our skies are up for grabs. We don't know what's up there. You know, our senses can't pick it up. Is, you know, they think that the public is stupid about this, but we're not. So this is the nature of the problem of how they communicate on that level. They just would kind of like go back to sleep on this. So keep that in mind. What he's suggesting here is that this special technology, which we possess, but we don't want to share with the public, that the Chinese also have it, and they're trying to demonstrate that against us by having it fly in our skies unfettered. And this is what he's putting across now in this message. And he actually asks his contact here, who it becomes the guest on the Sean Ryan podcast, he asked him, can you get me around on the podcast network because I'm headed to Mexico, but I'm afraid, with all this information that I have, that they're tracking me. Now, he goes on to say, the so what is because of the speed and stealth of these unmanned aircraft. They are the most dangerous threat to national security that has ever existed. They basically have an unlimited payload capacity and can park it over the White House if they wanted to. He just writes WH. Of course, that's White House. It's checkmate. USG, United States government, needs to give the history of this and how we are employing it and weaponizing it, how China is employing them, and what the way forward is. China is poised to attack anywhere on the East Coast. I've been followed for over a week now from likely Homeland or FBI, and they are looking to move on me and are unlikely going to let me cross into Mexico, but won't because they know I am armed and I am a massive V-bed. I have a massive V-bed, and what the guest told Sean Ryan was that basically means I have a large explosive in my vehicle. I've been trying to maintain a very visible profile. I've kept my phone, and they are definitely digitally tracking me. I have knowledge of this program and also war crimes that were covered up during airstrikes in Nimruz province of Afghanistan. And then he sounds off almost like a WikiLeaks Chelsea Manning type disclosure thing about some activities there that were covered up, and the DEA was involved. And then they delete two names out of this. The producers of the podcast that let this out in the first place. So he says, finally, you need to elevate this to the media so we avoid a world war, because this is a mutually assured destruction situation. For vetting, my LinkedIn is Matt Berg or Matthew Livelsberger. An active duty 18Z out of 110 is my profile in public. I have an active TSSCI with UAP and USAP access. Now, the UAP there, of course, relates, it's that name there that they're using for UFOs now on the inside. Now, here's the interesting thing about all this. What you have is a situation right off the bat, which is a tragedy, which is this person is blown up who also has a gunshot wound to their head outside of Trump Tower in a Tesla. Okay, so it's highly provocative from a number of different angles. And then we have these messages that were sent before it happened, so it does lend some credibility to them instead of just thinking, well, this is just an op straight up. And yet there's an awful lot of ops feelings involved. What I would say right off the bat is there's a real UFO file fingerprint with this guy. It's undeniable. He was pointing out Area 51, first off. Second of all, when they tracked his progression there, he was hanging out in Kingman, Arizona. It's quite fascinating because Kingman, Arizona was the site of a major UFO retrieval situation back in the 1950s. And it also is the first letter of the Kona Blue Code. So we have a lot of strange pieces of the UFO file there. And then at the end, he says, I have this UAP clearance too. And also a special access program clearance. So he's indicating a very high level of security clearance. The people who knew him said he was very pro-Trump and that he was just kind of like, a hardcore Americana guy, super patriot. So there's something very strange about what took place with him. And also the fact that although the body was, burned so badly, it's very difficult to get an ID, but they found his passport, it gives you those 9/11 vibes when the FBI guy is walking by and he's like, oh, hey, look, a passport just landed on top of this pile of rubble and I can identify all the hijackers. So, we have to be very clear that none of this is it's not very clear what actually took place. But what we can say for sure is this guy had, or somebody using his name had contacted a series of retired military people that he thought he could get some whistleblower justice through. And he thought maybe if I make myself very public. So there's a lot they're in that situation. And as I said, a lot of weird forces and independent media are grabbing bits of it and not crediting it to the source, which is a big problem. So what I would say is a situation we'll keep our eye on, and I think that there are going to be developments around this. There seems to be, between the drone situation and the series of explosions, in this interim period where President Trump is president-elect but hasn't assumed office yet, there seems to be a lot of posturing and a lot of dangerous moves. There may be a group inside there that actually wants to prevent the whole thing from happening, as we've pointed out on a couple of occasions. All we can do is hope that that team is being very vigilant about the president's movements and about the president-elect's movements. And I think it's odd, too, that Liz Cheney got the congressional, the Presidential Medal of Freedom for all of her efforts, because she's connected directly to that COG machinery through Dick Cheney, who set up and adjusted all the rules in 2007. But he'd been working for COG since the 1970s. And, in this program, we make a great fuss about COG because the series of deep events that have shaped human history in the United States, from the Kennedy assassination to 9/11, always involved these continuity of government players. John Dean in Watergate, the Secret Service agent in the Kennedy assassination, Oliver North, Iran-Contra, Dick Cheney and Dick Rumsfeld, 9/11, and even the financial coup d'etat and the COVID op have these personnel involved as well. So it's something to really keep a close eye on, and we certainly will. We might do a special report just on this story as more details open up. But it's great to be with you here in the new year. Well, New Year started with a bang, indeed. And we have a spectacular episode coming up here for you with the TUAOI Atlantis Firestone crystal in the HotZone. And we're going to be taking your questions also in the second part of the program. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch and lets you know about all the exciting things that we have coming up for you here in 2025, including very special interviews, mind-blowing X-Series interviews, the documentaries. Our latest documentary, of course, is JFK, The Final Speech, which has the whole Antarctica NASA UFO file in it. Absolutely groundbreaking information there. And I've made that documentary free. It's available on this channel for you. We have very exciting documentary series coming up for you in 2025, dealing with the HotZone, which is what we're dealing with tonight, along with live events and everything else. It's all there in that free newsletter. So go to darkjournalist.com and make sure you're signed up for it. Like I said, we'll take your questions in the second half of the program. You can ask those. Miss Olivia's putting them together now. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
First off, the slow mode is glitching. If it is possible to take it off, I'm going to ask you to take it off. If not, that's okay. Tim Houston says, well, 2025 has hit the ground running in the weirdness stakes. And Jonathan Kiner says, can't wait to get DJ's take on the latest psyops.
Yeah. Well, I tried to lay out as much as has come in there in the opening, but I do think it's something that we might have to do just a dedicated report on. Whenever you get around a situation like this and you see a UFO footprint in it, that fingerprint of deep involvement, I noticed that with General Van Herk and General Gio, the COG commanders, that they both came from these hardcore UFO identified backgrounds. And one of them was actually part of the 509th bomb group, which, although, he's way past the generation that discovered the Roswell information. Roswell, the 509th was the group that found all the Roswell wreckage back in 1947. Those types of things are set up in advance. There's no question about it. And of course, the leader of Space Force, he also was at the Malmstrom Air Force Base, which, had the famous incident in 1967 where UFOs actually shut the nuclear missiles off. So all of these guys with that fingerprint, there's a reason for that, which is they have access to that very deep, deep program. And that program I've identified is called Blue. I don't know what program names that they've put out there, but I put that name out in early spring of 2023, and the government a year later had to confirm it because it was just out there. And they were like, oh yeah, it didn't mean anything though. We didn't actually recover any alien artifacts, but that was the name of the program. Well, that whole thing with Immaculate Constellation that's supposed to be, these big revelations by the intelligence community through flunkies like Michael Schellenberger and Lou Elizondo standing there, pretending that he's a whistleblower, all that stuff was concocted as a way to just throw people off the trail in relation to this. So none of that congressional activity is worth, it's not worth the spit talking about it, as it were. Now, one of the things I will say is I think it's going to be, let's say, more difficult with the drone situation, with what they're doing, to deny some fundamental aspects there in the UFO file. So let's keep that in mind as we get into 2025. I have a few predictions about 2025, not psychic predictions, just kind of things on the ground I want to put across. But what I really want to harken back to again and again is that potency in the reporting. Look for the potency and sort of shun the entertainment stuff that's going off a cliff, Enough of the junk conspiracy. Stay with the real stuff. The real stuff is loaded with, educational information, and we can get really far down the path with it. But, if you have this other stuff coming in and dominating, or if you have CIA people pretending to be whistleblowers, you're living in fantasy land. Let's deal with reality. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 183, 2I Atlantis Firestone crystal in the hot zone. We're going to get deep into that now. Miss Olivia, what you said in relation to the slow mode thing. So we'll see if it works itself out. If not, I'll give it a shot. But you know how it goes. Trying to get anything technical this late in the game, it's not so hot.
Blazing River said, I think if one refreshes the slow-mo, corrects itself. Did for Blazing River. So
good.
Yeah,
it seems it looks like it's working just fine over here. So let's fingers crossed.
What it is it's you put it on 15 seconds and it's like 2 minutes for people.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, I have a cold, everybody. I'm recovering.
And she's doing great. Okay. All right. A lot of information dealing with the ancient past is, of course, very foggy and comes from documents and things where the meaning gets skewed over time, etc. However, there's a mystery, a tradition deep in those mystery schools about reading the Akashic Chronicle, the Akashic records, to obtain this information. And there are certain individuals who can attune themselves to these events and, in a retrocognitive state, go back and look at what happened. And in the case of Edgar Cayce and Rudolf Steiner, who both had this ability to do this, over and over again, their statements have been backed up dramatically. And in Cayce's situation, over 4 decades of Atlantean readings, you can now go back and see so many things that he pointed out as where it was and all the rest of it. Through time, science is starting to catch up with these people. So this is the nature of it. And that deep tradition back there tells us that Atlantis operated and existed on one side, the Gulf of Mexico, there in the Atlantic, and on the other side in the Mediterranean. So that was the size of the continent there. And this is the location of the continent. I know people like to put Atlantis and all these other places, Asia or Antarctica, etc. No, it didn't exist there. There were other cultures. Lemuria, for example, was there in the Pacific. But Atlantis, according to mystery tradition and according to Plato, which is the main sources around it, dead center in the Atlantic. Now, Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet, and his story of it is probably the most complete of anyone. And it is fascinating the amount of details that he put out on this. One of the things that he made the point of is that the Atlanteans had a technology called the TUAOI stone technology, which was a massive crystal power grid that powered the entire continent and had this thing set up all over the world. Now, what happened at a certain point through their warring activities is that the TUAOI stone was set at too high a level and caused the splitting of the islands into three. And the massive destruction of Atlantis, there were three islands at the end, according to Casey: Poseidon, Arion, and Og. And Poseidia is the one that I really want to point out, because Poseidia is the one that was in the HotZone area and where the TUAOI stone was located. And what happened there was the massive devastation when it pulled down the final vestiges of Poseidia. What was left were Bimini and the Bahamas and all the rest of it. And there's a series of readings that Casey gave around 1930 where he starts talking about Bimini and the temple of Poseidia rising off the coast of Bimini. What's interesting is just to think about that state that someone gets into to read the Akashic record. And I found a quote from Rudolf Steiner. I'm going to rely on a lot of quotes tonight, but this one in particular I think was helpful. And here's what Steiner has to say, so we get a gist of how they get the information when they're in what state that they're in. This is Steiner writing about the Akashic record. Quote, "This present essay will also show that at a certain high level of cognitive power, man can penetrate to the eternal origins of things which vanish with time. The one who has acquired the ability to perceive in the spiritual world comes to know past events and their external character. The events do not stand before him like the dead testimony of history, but appear in full life in a certain sense. What has happened actually takes place before him." That's the kind of vivid recollection that happens for somebody who can read this Akashic record. Now, it's interesting because it's actually, according to Casey, Plato's ability to read the Akashic record that gave him the most details there about the story. But of course, he has a relative who goes and spends all this time with the Egyptian priests, and they tell him the story. And then the story is related back to him in a series of dialogues in Timaeus, which is a very famous Plato tract. Now, this background, of course, is shared by all of these different cultures relating to a point where a flood takes place and completely takes out civilization. Of course, the Noah story is part of that. And we know now that based on precession, based on the pole shifts and things of this nature, that these types of disasters can indeed happen, and we've lived through them in the past. However, part of the Atlantis destruction, according to Casey, had to do with this TUAOI stone basically being tuned too high and then backfiring. It's kind of like, you know, a nuclear meltdown on a massive scale. So what takes place, this event that takes place, the final one that really just destroys the whole area in the Bahamas, it's very interesting because that one seems to have had the most impact. And he actually dates these different destructions over time, including a major one that takes place in 50,722. A few people are aware that he actually dates Noah's flood to 22,600 BC in the Casey readings. And I want to say this about Casey as well, that there are a number of intuitives, clairaudience, and people over the years who wrote about things, and you know, they had a very interesting take on different things. But Casey's absolute ability to go in there and get deep information that could later be verified, I think, is unmatched in the history. So, especially when it comes to Atlantis. And I also think that some of the people involved, Blavatsky and Steiner, they had certainly the very ability to go in as Casey did. But I feel that the mystical orders that they belonged to prevented them from allowing certain things out. And certainly Casey had a filter as well, you know, so that the information would be used responsibly. But it does seem that, you know, here's Casey operating sort of independently. He's under, you know, the mystery schools kind of follow him around. But I think in the case of Blavatsky and Steiner, they're literally part of the order. So it opens things up in a different way. Of course, when Blavatsky's book came out, ISIS Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine, that was viewed by a number of different schools as who let the information out? Like, where is this coming from? Are you kidding? This is the kind of stuff that would, have you burned at the stake only a century earlier. So there was a series of sort of revelations that came out of the mystery schools over time. I'm going to focus in on Casey tonight, but I want you to know the foundations are there in the 19th century with the Blavatsky's theosophical work on Atlantis and then Steiner's overarching vision of this. And they gave us this piece in this era because they knew we were going to need it. And the question is, why are we going to need it? We're going to face the exact same circumstances and do it all to ourselves all over again. And here we are in our Atlantean echo, as it were. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is TUAOI Atlantis, the Firestone crystal in the HotZone. We're going deep, deep tonight into Edgar Cayce's vision of the Atlantean Firestone power grid and how it had dual abilities. It wasn't just used for the purposes of energy on the Earth. It also had an interface with what he would refer to as the outer spheres, or sometimes the saintly realm. We're going to take your questions in the second half of tonight's program, X Series 183. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Nana says, somehow I cannot help but think of Pawgate anytime the TUAOI is mentioned, like a gut feeling connection.
Yeah, Pawgate, we have 2 episodes from 2023, Pawgate 1 and Pawgate 2, which is all about how the Hall of Records that the Atlanteans left behind, which left a record of their culture. But as you're also going to find out tonight, I'm going to read the quote from the Cayce readings. Those halls of record also contain the construction information, the actual kind of cookbook for the TUAOI stone. So the whole thing about archaeological wars, the ultimate archaeological artifact for these deep state players to get their hands on would be the TUAOI stone, which is why there's been such a CIA interest in the Hall of Records, to the point where in CIA documents, which I have, and it's well known now that this is out, that they infiltrated the Cayce organization, the ARE, in 1964, and placed people inside trying to get information on whether or not the Hall of Records was the real deal or not. Now, we know they've been engaged in some unusual things over the years, including psychic investigations and studying the past lives of different individuals. Try that one on. Well, how about their search for Noah's Ark? Yeah, they had a whole heavy financed program searching out there for Noah's Ark. So, you're instantly in a different realm when you're dealing with the intelligence agencies that you wouldn't think about. You're always thinking about them in geopolitical terms. Well, we need to start to think about the ancient archaeological discoveries as a geological, a geopolitical as well as a geological factor in all this. It'll wrap our heads around it a little better. Let's get a handle on a very important artifact that we put on the record and how it relates to these HotZone discoveries, and how the HotZone itself may become one of the most determining factors in terms of not only future technology, but the human origin story in the future, which is why you're going to see so much tension between Cuba and in a variety of ways in the Caribbean. And the UFO file is so heavily, sort of jacked up in the HotZone. The other thing, of course, is that we have AUTEC down there, which is basically the underwater Area 51, and it's on Andros Island, which is just, I mean, you're so close to Bimini on Andros Island. Let's look at something. The way we'll backtrack this is to find the stragglers, the group that left Atlantis before Poseidia went down and came to America. We've dealt with the Egyptian side. It's going to come up tonight anyway, but we're going to go into America a little bit, and we're going to find ourselves actually in places like Arizona, which was a major hotspot for the fleeing Atlanteans. Well, there's a good reason for that. They were developing so much of the lapis in those mines, in the copper mines in Arizona, according to the Casey readings, that they had a natural route back there, back and forth. So when Poseidon goes down, Arizona and Utah are places that they know quite well. There are a number of unexplained artifacts throughout the Americas, and I think that, between people like Graham Hancock and others, are now really trying to spotlight and doing a good job of spotlighting America. And that whole aspect is interesting because it was brought forward by the Mormons as part of their religion, that in fact these ancient groups existed in America and built up cultures, had wars and all these other things that go far beyond the primitive histories that we hear about so often in traditional history. I want to point out an individual here in a painting. This is found in a mound in Spiro, Oklahoma. And the Spiro mounds kind of charts this Mississippi River culture. And they don't know what to make of it because it's not Mayan, but it's got something in common with them for sure. Take a look at this effigy from one of the mounds. Now notice his eye has this very interesting design around it.
Oh, wow.
Now, he has that TUAOI stamp, as I call it. Now, the artifact that we brought forward came out of Clarence Bloomfield's different work. And he had a very interesting and a very heavy book. I think that book weighs about 20 pounds. And it was hard to take down to the cafe and stuff. Copper plate discovered by Clarence Bloomfield Moore at Mount Royal, Florida, in the HotZone, 1894. Take a look. Well, I've highlighted this. I even put it in the previous thumbnail for the episode we just did in the HotZone, the compilation at the end of the year. But there, in fact, is that image. Now, keep that image in mind. I'm going to go back to this other one here real quickly. And Bloomfield, as I've pointed out, now he was the son of Clara Bloomfield, and she was the one who financed both Keeley and Tesla. So this whole piece about, Tesla, advanced technology, Keeley, ether technology, and the fact that he already had airships in 1870, we're starting to get into territory which might lead you to believe, someone was working on the ancient side, the ancient technology, and with the help of Clara Bloomfield, financing these guys, then this came to be the part that her son goes deep into the HotZone and finds these things. Now, take a look again at the figure. There it is. So there's that TUAOI stamp right around the eye. I think the whole culture became an offshoot of this memory of the TUAOI stone, and they sought over and over again to conjure up its abilities once again, because after all, they controlled the world through a worldwide grid. But because the nature of the Atlantis destruction was so devastating, and it took everything down and took everything out, it would be like bringing this culture back to, stone knives and the whole bit. So, if you made the United States a parking lot again, you'd have to start from scratch, because not a lot of people actually even know how to do things. How many of us know how to build a car, for example, and would be able to do that in the aftermath? Now, you can see how civilization can be brought to its knees when it becomes too arrogant. And the story, of course, in Plato's Atlantis version is that they angered the gods. Well, that's very interesting. I'm going to show maybe how that was accomplished. In those very same mounds, we find another character they call the Birdman, and very often he is holding what looks like a head. Now, because they haven't found other things, about human sacrifice or anything relating to these tribes, they don't know. They don't know what to make of the head. But one of the things I can tell you is the motif of this head that he's holding represents the kind of ancient knowledge that the Atlanteans had. Here's a shot of that character, the Birdman. And there's a number of things there going on, but what's most interesting is what's on top of his head, in my opinion, and also the fact of what he's holding there in his left hand. Now, I'm going to tweet out on some of these images, but another thing I want to point out again is this motif. It goes around these spiro mounds there coming out. And here we have the eye in the hand. So this culture that is lost there is something that Casey identified, which were the fleeing Atlanteans who came into America and operated in that Mississippi River area and came to places like Arizona and came to places like Arkansas and Oklahoma. Now, Casey's description of the two-eye stone is something we're going to get into next, and then the dissection of that description by a NASA scientist and how we come to kind of combine the idea of a spiritual stone that can elevate human consciousness, but also simultaneously act as the world's most powerful laser and directed energy weapon is going to be something that may surprise some of you, but it has a psychic aspect, and that's the thing we need to keep in mind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is TUAOI Atlantis Firestone Crystal in the Hot Zone. We're going deep, of course, and we started the show off with the breaking news that they were getting some details about this individual who was supposedly blown up outside of a Tesla, or inside of a Tesla outside of the Trump Tower. And one of those Tesla trucks, a very unusual story, and we're going to be tracking more of that as we go along here, along with the fact of the drone tie-in, but some of those details were coming in just as we were going live. We may do a special for you just on that. Before I go any further, of course, I want to remind you that tonight we're going to take your questions in the second half of the program. We're going to go a couple hours with you tonight. But before I go any further, what do you got?
Twilight Miss says, he's a living two-eye stone, looks like. Are they actual tattoos? Because that is hardcore tattoo work, if so. And Joseph Tuga says, I wonder if they read palms.
Oh, well, there's a weird thing about eyes. When Casey's talking about the early Atlanteans, he always talks about their third eye, and that in some of them it was visible, and we've seen that before. We've seen depictions of it in movies and things. But one of the things I find interesting is he said that there was a kind of interpenetrability with the Atlanteans at that point, so that they were almost half etheric, half physical. So if you needed a particular sense, like if you needed your eye somewhere, like in your arm, it would appear there. It would,
Excuse me, what?
Yeah. Your whole, the way he describes it is the whole body was interpenetrable. So the ability to kind of manipulate the body mass and shapeshift it was something that they could do. We became much harder over time. And this is something that's quite fascinating. There's a Steiner story where they ask him about Helena Blavatsky and basically said, she got taken over and over again. At one point her maid actually, takes the house that she owns and takes her to court and takes over the house. So, like what happened to Blavatsky? If she was so psychic, how did she get taken in all these schemes and things? And Steiner said, well, she was a very unusual person because she still had the kind of softness that the Atlanteans had. And she had that interpenetrability with the world. And so those types of psychics, it doesn't allow for guile. There's no guile in them. And so they completely are interactive with the world. So that's kind of the price that they pay for being so incredibly, having such vision, being such a visionary, that their ability to discern things the way that our hardened minds would and be able to spot a phony and things of that nature just don't happen, which seems like a contradiction in terms, but I found his explanation fascinating. And, they thought he was talking metaphysically or symbolically, and they said, what do you mean that, she was softer, she had a softer attitude? And he said, no, her actual skull was softer. So there are a lot of aspects on the psychic side that we don't understand that go a lot further, as it were. What else you got?
This is a question we always get. Bomb Tech. Is this two-eye stone at the Bermuda Triangle? Is it responsible?
Yes, yeah, it is. And think about what Casey said happened with it. It pulled everything down. It set off volcanic explosions and then pulled the islands down. And previously, it had been used literally to fly things, create a power grid, and you could power vehicles that could go underwater, power vehicles that could go through things. If you look into the Casey readings, he's talking about, you know, they have flying craft that not only can fly over mountains, they can fly through them. So, you know, that kind of metamorphosis technology, where does that come from? Where do we hear about that? So basically, they could disappear through things. And this is where some of that Apotheum piece picks up later in the UFO file when you see, oh, you know, there's this a Japanese pilot is over Alaska and he's looking down at this huge craft as big as 2 football fields. And he's giving all this blow by blow information about it. And then at a certain point, he says, oh, wait, I can see through it. So somebody else there is using that very same technology that Casey's talking about that can just sort of blink out and blink in at will. And there's a number of physicists and things who could give us, you know, theories about dimension jumping and things of this nature. We're just not there yet in the public, but somebody's playing with that. There's no question in my mind. Yeah, that is interesting.
Blazing River. Did the stones have something to do with magnetic fields? Sounds like it.
Yes. As a matter of fact, the person who reconstructed it, William Hutton, who was a NASA scientist, he said that when he reconstructed the model, it had all sorts of magnetic properties. And I'm going to read some quotes from him in a minute that will give us an overview on that. And then I'm going to go into where else this may have appeared in history and we just sort of missed it, as it were. Casey considered it very important, and I always thought it was a little gold mine sitting there in the readings, and it's something that we brought forward dramatically because, for me, it's such a powerful thing the way he describes it. It literally determined the outcome of their lives. It was the ultimate energy source that the Atlanteans used. And the Amelia's group, which used it in the beginning, they would use it, again, to contact the outer spheres, and they would groom their priestesses from a very early age to just interact with the crystal and do this. So they would interact with the two-eye crystal, and they set them up as channels and raise them that way. And then by the time they were adults, they could interface completely with this thing and bring forward this information from the saintly realm. Well, the way that Casey describes the Belial group, who's the darker group in Atlantis, they are the ones who are highly imitative. And at times, I don't get the impression that they're fully human either. This is the strange thing about them. But nonetheless, you have these two groups, the Amelia's group and the Belial group. And what happens is the Belial group, by being imitative and by infiltrating the Amelia's group, they learn the technology, but without the spiritual application. And they use it for physical domination. And they war with the Amelia's group for centuries. And eventually part of that warring is splitting the islands up. And the final frontier for the good guys, the Amelia's group, is Poseidia, which is the area that is there in between Bimini and Cuba, and all the strange things that take place in the HotZone. Now, I always like to give a little overview, since we've done something like 30 episodes on the HotZone in a major documentary, which is available right here. And it's in the description of this video. And that one is called The CRAZE in the HotZone, Hacking Atlantis. And all the information about this is in there. It's about an hour and a half. But basically, that area of the HotZone, you're operating right off the coast of Florida. You're operating in Bimini. You're operating off the western tip of Cuba, and then the Yucatan Peninsula, right down there and through the Caribbean. Now, overlapping that is the Bermuda Triangle, oddly enough. But that area, the HotZone, I had, through a number of different channels, found out that the area was called the HotZone because if you were down there and you were part of a military a group or if you were part of a company mapping the ocean floor, whatever it happened to be, if you saw ruins down there, you could not talk about them. And it was a court-martial offense. You could go to jail. All sorts of things would happen to you. But they had the most stringent rules. And it was very common for people to see things, like if you were down there and you saw a huge pyramid shape, you could report it, but you could not talk about it publicly. And they said anything that's in this area, and they referred to the area under a bunch of different names, but fundamentally the idea was this is this hot zone area. So that's where the whole hot zone concept comes from. The idea that there's been this much geopolitical intrigue in places like Cuba. I mean, we almost went to nuclear war over Cuba. Can you say that about many other places? The fact that all these things have taken place there, the drug running, and the fact that we still have these bizarre things happen, like major earthquakes in Haiti that seem engineered, blackouts through Cuba, it still is that area of intrigue over and over again. So one of the things we pointed out in last week's overview on the hot zone is a woman that we've pointed out on a number of different occasions. Her name is Polina Zalitsky, and she was the ocean engineer who found an entire city off the western tip of Cuba. This is the same place that Ernest Hemingway had been going over and photographing and using highly sensitive scientific equipment for years, going over that area. And we went into great detail. I've gone into great detail before about Casey and Hemingway and the closeness and the overlapping thing, and how Casey gave all these readings for Hemingway's mother, and how she was one of his biggest students, and how when he was giving the readings about Bimini, she shared that information with Ernest, and Ernest went to Bimini looking for all of this. So you have to get to the weight and the heft of what the hot zone is really all about. Of course, Mary Hemingway, the widow of Ernest Hemingway, would become close with President Kennedy, trying to get him to get all of that Atlantis information out of Cuba that had been lost when the Hemingways were forced to flee and get out during the Cuban Revolution. And they did. They were able to get that information back, apparently, and that's why you have in the JFK Library this incredible trove, the biggest trove anywhere. No Ernest Hemingway museum has anything even close to what is there of Ernest Hemingway. In the Kennedy Museum, it makes no sense unless you can see it through the lens of the hot zone information. So we start to orient ourselves around what the hot zone is and the reason that a number of different groups may be involved there. I've also cited Egerton Sykes, who was a retired British intelligence agent who had the largest Atlantis library of anyone, donated it to the Casey Foundation eventually, but felt that it wasn't, people weren't really getting this whole thing about the intrigues in the hot zone, and how he himself had seen on one of his expeditions a temple of Isis right in the Bahamas, but he would not give the location. And he said a number of different countries are aware of things there in international waters in the hot zone. And there's an intrigue because China was interested in it. Certain countries from South America are interested in it. Cuba, the US, Russia, they're all there circling around these ancient ruins and their implication for changing human history and the human origin story. You can see the intrigues run very, very deep when you get into the hot zone. So what I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to try to cite some of the quotes that Casey gives us a hint of what it was all about, this TUAOI power grid, and how the Atlantean civilization rose to this tremendous height and then became a series of legacy cultures, and how that period now has come upon us once again. So we're in that Atlantean crucible, as it were. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, TUAOI Atlantis Firestone Crystal in the Hot Zone, X Series, episode 183. We're taking your questions in about a half hour here in the second half of the program. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Wendy Madison wants to know, has the TUAOI stone been found and removed? Doesn't seem like there have been many Bermuda Triangle disappearances in many decades. That's true. Of course, they might fly around it because they know what the danger zone is.
Yeah, apparently it upset the entire, if you go into certain aspects in certain places in the Bermuda Triangle, your compass spins backwards. Well, the magnetic reality shifts there. And that also happens in the hot zone. Missing time also happens in the hot zone. People go into green or mustard colored clouds and then come out and, it's an hour and a half later. But it seems like 5 minutes. There's a lot of this activity that takes place. So when you're getting down there, it's hard for us to quantify it in our mind. But I'll give you a hint that it must run very, very deep. And here's the hint that I think is an absolute bombshell. Now, Thomas Townsend Brown, who was one of the deepest black scientists that we employed, and who was somebody who was on the X-Share tip, who wanted, the culture to be rewarded by the things we were discovering, and had a long, long history there in Cuba, including going there in 1930 as part of a secret Navy experimental thing about sending down these submersibles then. And it's interesting with Thomas Townsend Brown because when he gets there, there's a massive earthquake the first day he shows up. And I almost wondered, did they have him show up, cause the earthquake, so that whatever they were looking for, they could get their hands on? Because the timing is just very, very unusual. But one of the things that he does and that they send him off to do is to meet with this person on this very kind of lavish yacht called the Caroline. And when he gets on that yacht, he notices that the owner hands him this glass case, and inside of it is the original version of Alice in Wonderland. And he says, why have you got it in this case? And the guy says, well, if the yacht ever goes down, the copy will survive. That's very important. What's interesting is this guy will eventually go to the Calvin Coolidge White House and show this particular, original copy of Alice in Wonderland to President Coolidge. There are a number of unusual things there, including heavy Rosicrucian influence around the writing of Alice in Wonderland. But instantly, when Thomas Townsend Brown gets involved with Cuba, he's in a kind of twilight zone of influences. And what ultimately happens is he goes every year to what his family thinks is San Antonio, San Antonio, Texas. And they're like, oh, he's going to San Antonio, having a great time, sort of taking time for himself as a scientist, and the family just deals with it. Upon his death, his daughter told me that they found all of these different records of the fact that it was not San Antonio, Cuba that he was going to. It was San Antonio. It was not San Antonio, Texas he was going to. It was San Antonio, Cuba. Now, San Antonio, Cuba is very interesting because it's in the Paulina Zalitsky story, and it's off that tip of San Antonio that she finds this massive underwater city. Now, it's interesting because she didn't just find a few ruins, she found an entire metropolis. That story is just sitting out there. And in a way, for us to follow up on anything else relating to Atlantis and archaeology is almost kind of ridiculous. Because we have this entire story, we have proof that it's there, and it's just lost and covered over in this hot zone intrigue. The entire thing has been covered up, and yet we know there's been massive reporting originally on it because they could not get around the fact that it had been discovered and it was already in the Cuban media. So they could not box it in. They had to report it even in the New York Times, even in National Geographic. But they were able over time to shut down the story. And what they did is very interestingly, because Zalitsky was not an archaeologist, they used the kind of jealousy of the archaeological world to boot her out. And if that didn't work enough, as I've mentioned with Paulina, she's gone through a number of different difficulties. One of the interesting things that happened to her is that she was put in a Mexican prison. That, to me, was a message saying, that was after she was booted out by the Cuban Navy, after Cuba had originally hired her to come in there and survey off the coast. So the whole thing is quite remarkable. But did she go too far by talking about it, putting the story out there before they had a handle on what it was? Could be. I think there was a number of things that were involved there. But oddly enough, in a kind of semi-obscure episode that I did last year, it came out during all the Trump intrigues around Trump's assassination. And I personally, when I select episodes of the X series, they're not always the ones that performed the best. We've had episodes that have done like 600,000, 700,000 views, but there are episodes where if I think the message came across, I'll still select them as one of my favorites. And one of those episodes from last year is called Wise Guys in the Hot Zone. And the reason it's so important is going to be more apparent later this year, because in there I describe a series of things that came out that Polina Zalitsky had put in a book allegorically. And the whole story was about a dog who goes to Cuba and helps the Cuban government find these secret Atlantean treasures.
That's a crazy episode.
Yeah, it is. And it's got, the story was actually about Frank Sinatra and the mafia in Cuba, but it has this, Easter egg in the heart of it. And it's one of the reasons that we used it in our end of the year clips situation. I have, since I mentioned it out of order, I'm going to read a quote from Polina Zalitsky's very unusual allegorical tale. I'm telling you, cracking the piece around the hot zone and the Atlantean ruins is going to require cracking open the Polina Zalitsky discoveries off the western tip of Cuba. And that whole piece of what they were doing, we still only have a hint of what they found. But one of the things that she reports in this book, and again, using it as an allegorical fairy tale about a dog and all the rest, called Dog Days in Cuba, in fact, is that the Pope comes down to visit, which is true, in 1998, and he comes down to check out these very special ruins. And the fact that Castro, knowing that the Vatican archives would hold all this information about Atlantis, that he invites the Pope to the island, which is kind of the ultimate heresy for the revolutionaries, after all, and that the Pope goes, is very telling that they had made this discovery. And that's the same time that they invite her down to do this work. Now, in that book, there's just a couple of very interesting, juicy hints I'm going to give here, and I'm going to provide in an upcoming part of that miniseries on the Hot Zone a much more detailed overview of the things I've found in this book, but I want to give you this as a hint going forward. So the dog is working with these scientists, trying to get a handle on all the things that are going on. And at certain points, they give him this brain interface to put on. And it's through the brain interface that he can get to all the ruins and everything else. That's going to become important as we get into it. But try to catch some of the hints here in the allegorical fairy tale book that Zalitsky wrote. After all, this is an ocean engineer who found lost ruins in real life. So what is she trying to tell us here that she may still be under, some kind of limitations to talk about publicly? Quote, "We didn't know how deep it was at the center. The scientists measured it as large as 92 meters by 57 meters and approximately 10 meters deep at the shore. Amazing crystal sculptures. I've heard of these before. How do they form underground?" "There's a phreatic cave," answered Armando. "Its karst is cracked and rainwater seeps in. It passes through organic material and picks up carbon dioxide gas, creating carbonic acid," and then goes on from there. And there's that wonderful word in here, which is a big key, all about these caves, and the word is guana hana kabibis. I think I've done my best with that one. Guana hakabibis. Okay, guana hakabibis. "The terrestrial rivers are running under the Diente del Poro, coastal Saborico," said Armando. "They emerge in the mountains and find their way to the sea, moving along through cracks and spelts in the isthmus until they deposit into the sea or collect as lakes in large underground depressions, like this one. Our humans were worried about their compasses being still not functional. The same happened to Giovanni when he attempted to start his metal detector. The needle of his instrument was also turning around in chaos. Remember, the entire apotheum effect exists around these ruins. This is why the whole San Antonio area is called sorda, meaning death. Meaning no radio or electromagnetic signals could be detected there. Look at the marine navigational maps and you will see that the marine channel running parallel to the whole coast of Cabo de San Antonio is called Paso Sorda del Muerto, Deaf Channel of Dead. A pretty nasty name, and nobody knows why. We suspect there are uranium deposits somewhere in the area. Rubio and I were less concerned about the lost magnetic signals. We went around the dark lake to the center and noticed slight movement in the water downstream where it was possibly discharging at a distance into an underground level. Inside, we saw unimaginable forms. It is magic. Nature is a true artist creating these structures that are apparently made of crystal. So, LIVESTREAM went in there and she made all these discoveries, and she came out and she showed pictures of these pyramids. And then when she was asked about them, she said, look, they have hieroglyphs on them. And so these aren't just, some nebulous structures. They have, genuine hieroglyphs. And the woman who was interviewing her said, do you mean Egyptian hieroglyphs? And she said, no, just like mine hieroglyphs, And she said, by the way, it's not just a pyramid or a structure here or there. It's an entire metropolis. This is the nature of the problem in the HotZone, which is you have this massive piece there. Now, one of the things I've put on the record is some of these NASA astronauts have seen it because of where they've gone to. And they've had to remain quiet about it. But one of them, Gordon Cooper, let some of this out in different ways. And this is going to be majorly explosive over time, because what's happening is the area of land is rising. And this is what we get from the Casey readings and from Steiner's work in the mystery schools in general, which is land rising is a key that you don't hear anything about in scientific literature. When they talk about these things, they're always talking about, the water level's rising, whatever. They don't want to talk to you about land rising because that's something that they keep to themselves on the inside. But land is rising, and a number of people know, especially off the east coast of America, there's a massive island that is rising. And Casey's work, well, it's rising. The Temple of Atlantis, which sank there, it's rising again. It's rising off the coast of North Bimini. These are the things to keep in mind as we move forward into this. And LIVESTREAM gives us a hook there. Let's see if Casey can bring us through on that one. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalists X-Series episode 183, TUAOI Atlantis Firestone, Crystal in the HotZone. We're going to be taking your questions here now shortly, and we'll go with you till about 10:30. How's that sound? What do you got there?
Okay, Harry Didascalo, I think it is. Castro was a Jesuit, and Rebecca Ramalay says Castro made a deal with the Pope. If he could get the Vatican records on the treasure, he would find it and share it with the church, as well as let the church back into the country.
Well, see, I think that you're right, but is that a guess? I think if it's a guess, it's highly intuitive, and it definitely links up with what I was thinking. One of the things I learned when I went into this, and I'm going to do a whole section on the Pope and Castro, and I'm always nervous about announcing these things beforehand because there's a lot of plagiarization going on in the independent field, and there are people, I don't know where this is coming from, but they actually they use so much of the X-Series information, and they, shroud it in people like Elizondo and all the worst, like Mellon and the worst types of people. So you can see why I'm very hesitant at times to give out information, because one of the things that they've done is wrap these other people in this information that we're giving out here on this program, which is kind of, I guess, one of the weirdest twists. There was a a video that this Jesse Michaels guy had done, and he's just a rip-off artist, straight up. I'm just going to say it. And he's ripped off a number of concepts that we brought forward here on the program instead of just approaching me and asking me about them. You know, you don't have to hang out in the shadows and rip things off. But it's interesting to me because what he did is he wrapped Elizondo into the middle of the different things. And then he took pictures with Elizondo in front of a Masonic temple. I was like, well, I mean, how weird can you get? And that's how the field operates very often. So when I'm working on certain things, I won't let them out sometimes till the very last minute. And the reason for that is just because you see a lot of this reckless thing. And the thing is, like, there's so much information, you know, there's so much quality information, and there's so much you can work with if you cite your sources. You know, you just cite your sources. You're taught that in junior high. How is it the independent media is just because, you know, just as a weird grab bag thing where anything goes and people rip off ideas left and right? That doesn't seem right. That's probably a big thing that should change in 2025. And, you know, I make a meticulous effort to cite sources heavily around these things. And one of the things I mentioned today that took place with the whole story about the Las Vegas Tesla bombing thing is that somebody took the email that Sean Ryan put out, you know, that this guy had sent to his guest, and they were just running the thing, you know, and these podcasts that were doing that. It's like, what are you talking about? Cite the source of where it came from. I mean, it's, you know, if you can't have an environment,
people have no manners.
Well, you just can't have an environment like that. There's too many. I think the only thing that can really change that type of dynamic is when the audience is more questioning. It says, well, where did you get that? Like, what's the source on that? Or like, didn't I just see that last year on the Dark Journalist show? You know, so we need to be real about it too, because if you come in and you're packed with Peter Thiel money, you know, people still know, you know, people in the ideas room have been working with this material for a long time. You're not going to be able to just roll in and rip concepts off. And it's not, I mean, of course, it's not just me. There's so many people that happens to, but it's absurd. And when I watch it, it is something that I think, you know, I've had enough training in marketing and things like that and journalism that I can see marketing techniques, you know, and, famously, we exposed a lot of that with Gaia TV and the things that they were doing and how they really ruined the dialogue around the secret space program. So I do a lot of preemptive things so that people are very aware in terms of this information, you know, the HotZone information. It's very important to keep that potent strain of the information. And it comes directly from what we've brought forward about the Casey work and Steiner and Zalitsky and Blavatsky and all the rest of it. That all forms a kind of cogent, you know, a place of information that people can draw from. But if it's taken out of context, you know, or manipulated to sell a UFO threat narrative or whatever it is, then it becomes the kind of thing where it's a whole different matter. So I hope in 2025 we see a lot more of the other happening. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Wow. It's going to be a great year. That's the interesting thing that's going on. It is, yeah, because there are so many dynamics involved. We're taking your questions here shortly. What do you got, Miss Olivia?
Ray Story says, AUTEC is a U.S. Navy program, so U.S. military is always listening in the hot zone, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, there's a reason why the highest number of UFO sightings in that area is right near AUTEC. And I don't think they're down there investigating UFOs. I think they're down there literally. I mean, there's certainly maybe a certain amount of that, but I think they are testing them. And of course, you know, people in Bimini are so accustomed to UFO activity, they refer to them as fireflies. Keep that in mind as we go. All right, now the Casey track and the TUAOI stone. This is something important for us to figure out. Casey puts this thing out there. Later, a NASA scientist is curious about it. And he thinks to himself, what is Casey talking about? And he constructs a model a scale model to figure out what happens. And apparently a number of unusual things take place. Now, Casey's giving us the information that the two-eye stone is something that is not only a practical physical application, but has a heavy-duty psychic application, and how it's an interface for these priestesses to communicate with the saintly realm. So, I always say the idea, just picture opening up your laptop and talking with an ascended master, right? There's a number of different ways this can be used. What happens with the Belial group is they imitate what they do, the Amelius group does with the stone, and then they figure out the physical application, and then they use it just for that. So they're bringing forward, heavy duty physical domination based on the same technique, but they're not getting that spiritual interface. Here's what Hutton, who was the NASA scientist, had to say about the two-eye stone. And then I'm going to get into the character that Casey refers to as sort of taking what remained of the two-eye stone, the Firestones, into first Mexican America and then into the United States. Iltar. All right. This is Hutton. Ultraviolet lasers could be used if the prism were fashioned of pure silica, because silica is relatively transparent in the ultraviolet. Orbiting X-rays or gamma rays would offer even higher energy densities, speaking of the two-eye stone. If suitable prism materials and reflective surface materials could be found, the source of the reading's description of the Firestone includes a capstone that directed an output beam from the prism. Evidently, once the gravitational field is generated by orbiting electromagnetic energy in the prism, it can then be reflected or directed somehow by a capstone. How such a device would function is anyone's guess. This is the scale model he drew from the Casey readings. A 6-sided bluestone crystal. But what he figured out after he took the measurements from the description in mind is that the capstone formed what we know traditionally as a 6-pointed star.
Wow.
So you have a religious crossover aspect going on here, and you start to think in your mind, what about the Ark of the Covenant? And some of these things. These are pieces of the Atlantean technology brought over into now this emerging culture, but it comes from a much earlier echo of this advanced culture. A little more from Hutton. Edgar Casey's source stated that in the earlier forms, the Atlantean technology was not used for generation of gravitational field, but for communications between infinity and the finite, and for communications, and those forces from the outside, and that it was further developed later for more mundane purposes. A different, somewhat more exotic description is given by Philos the Tibetan in the book that we quote many times in this program, Dweller on Two Planets. Here's the description. The great temple of Incal was called Enchalathon, was shaped like the Egyptian pyramid of Cheops. Within this, and in the most sacred place, was the Maxim, on a raised triangular platform of red granite, several inches higher than the floor of the auditorium, 36 feet between its points. In the very center of it was a large block of crystal quartz, upon the perfect cube of which rose the Maxim, or divine light. A flame of light like a giant spearhead, unwavering white glow. The great cube of quartz was 5.5 feet on all sides, from platform to tip of flame. Its height must have been over 3 times the height of a tall man. The flame made no heat, did not warm the quartz pedestal. It was fatal to anyone who touched it. That sounds familiar. No oil, no fuel, no electric currents fed it. No man tended it. The story of its beginning is giving as though it was brought into being by those sons of God. Now, the story of Iltar is interesting, keeping all this in mind, this advanced technology piece. Iltar is in Poseidia, and he's one of the leaders there. But he realizes that with the various destructions and things, that Poseidia is also going down. But he's the first to realize it before the others do. Traditionally, the mystery schools tell us that 10,500 BC is the date of the destruction of Atlantis. That's where Casey places it, and he pinpoints it there. The mystery schools in general have had the date somewhere between 12,000 BC and 6,000 BC. Casey pinpoints it to a certain place. Poseidia, it seems like, survived after the general demise of Atlantis for a little while, maybe for an additional couple thousand years. And that's why that area has so many interesting aspects to it. One of the things that Polina Zalitsky found was an ancient mountain system that connected Cuba and Yucatan underwater. So there's a number of things there that might make us think, well, Atlantis goes down, but somehow Poseidia hangs out just a little bit longer. And there's an egress of people from Poseidia directly into Mexico and then into southwestern America. Now, one of the stories that gets told in the Casey readings is about Iltar. And Iltar, there are many depictions of him, but he is basically like the early Mayan Noah. And there are depictions of him with these volcanoes going off and people dying in the flood, etc. And I found him in the Spiro Mounds too, the same kind of hero character leading them out. But what's interesting is that what he does is he becomes this focal point for where the third Hall of Records is going to be placed. So what happens is when they decide we're going to lay out the Hall of Records, they decide we're going to put it in 3 places in the world. So the advanced Atlantean initiates say, we're going over to Egypt, and we're going to place it there on the Giza Plateau in a spot that was already sacred and already held a temple of Atlantis way, way in the past. That's very unusual because traditionally we have the Pyramid of Giza and the Sphinx at 2500 BC. That's where the archaeologists place it, and Cheops and all the rest of it. Casey puts it back 10,500 BC, 8,000 years earlier. But here's the weird thing. He says that the people who put it there, the initiates, what they were doing is they were doing their own archaeology. They found the most sacred spot. And they said, oh, this is where 50,000 years earlier, this other temple of Isis stood. So how old is that plateau? Well, the pyramids may be 10,500 BC, but the plateau is much, much older, according to the Casey readings. And the spot, again, very important for a number of reasons. Now, the other 2 places are interesting, though. One of them is in the temple of Poseidia, which is on Bimini. And that sinks. So the other place that they go to put it in is Yucatan. And Iltar goes and he places it in the temple there, and it's still there. So the 3 places are all containing the same information about the Atlanteans, the Hall of Records, and the TUAOI Stone, under the paw of the Sphinx, off the coast of Bimini, and where they found the Bimini Road. Casey said in 68 or 69, you're going to start to see part of that temple with the Hall of Records. And that's where we found it. And then in Yucatan, and Yucatan is always the mysterious one because we keep wondering, where is that? There's a number of different researchers who've tried to figure this out. And one of the things that we put together was that fundamentally Guatemala is where that third Hall of Records is. But he says that the 3 halls are one. But Iltar has everything from the Atlantean civilization, and he comes in to Mexico. And so a lot of the ancient aspects around, how did they get this incredible astronomical information? How did they get the ability to do this incredible agriculture? How did they get the ability to make all these pyramids and everything else? Well, Iltar coming in there, he's, the master Atlantean. So I find it interesting in the descriptions around Iltar that Casey gives. I'm going to read a little bit of that, and then we're going to go to your questions. And before we do it, what do you got?
Johann Wolf says that is a close match with the Urantia book's, quote, sea of glass communication with the rest of the cosmos idea. John
Yeah,
Gauss
right.
says these things are computers. Crystalline structures can store information and intention and purpose. And
Oh, yeah.
Darcy Edmonds says
Yep.
you've got I'm not going to get the pronunciation right, a hexamer Menger sponge solid state quantum computer.
Yes. Well, we think about the things that crystals are used for. Fundamentally, crystals alter our entire culture, and we basically run the entire culture on crystals as well. So there's something fundamental. The message of this is that, it's fundamental to humanity, this interaction with the crystal. And I think what's missing now is the spiritual interaction with this. And we know there was a huge thing that came out of the 60s, which was a kind of new age movement towards stones, and that really peaked maybe sometime around the year 2000. And you still see it here and there, but there was a real fascination with it at one point. I'm going to tell you an odd thing about lapis lazuli. And when we get into this, there's a fantastic story about Casey in Arizona relating to that. So let's see if we can get that in tonight. A little bit about Iltar here. This is a Casey quote. The first temples erected by Iltar and his followers were destroyed at the period of change in the contours of the land. Those of that first civilization following have been discovered in Yucatan, but have not been opened. I found that weird. There's a whole controversy here where Casey says, well, they actually did find emblems of the Firestone, but they actually found some Firestones. They don't know what they are. And this was found during an expedition in 1933. He identifies the expedition and says it all went to the Pennsylvania State Museum. Later, they came to believe, it's actually UPenn that it went to. There's been some controversy about this, but I find it very, very interesting, the amount of, let's say, world-changing things that come out of the University of Pennsylvania. Here's what he had to say about it. We might have this evidence of Atlantis if we could only understand the significance of the unique stones in Yucatan back in 1933. Casey had apparently foreseen the archaeological activity that would turn up some relic of the gigantic firestone that the Atlanteans had used for seemingly unlimited power source. That's from Edgar Evans Casey on Atlantis. In Yucatan, there is emblem of Sane, the sleeping Casey had said. And as if to guide archaeologists to the stones, he cautioned, let's clarify this, for the pattern may be more easily found, for these pattern stones will be brought to the United States. A portion of it is to be carried to the Pennsylvania State Museum. It may only be a coincidence. In November of 1962, Fate magazine reported 3 elaborate sealed Mayan tombs over 2,000 years old have been discovered in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Archaeologists on the Yucatan Peninsula of Guatemala have confirmed. So Iltar had a version, a kind of a reduced version of the Firestone. And it's very interesting because I want you to think about it almost as like they had portable versions, almost like the iPad. And you can see in a lot of those depictions in Guatemala, a lot of these priests holding this thing, and it looks almost like they're holding an iPad. I think these are the miniature versions of the Firestone. And I think the Firestone is his reference to this smaller portable version of the TUAOI Stone. The TUAOI Stone is the massive power station, and these are the small sort of interactive parts.
What would they do with the Firestones?
Well, it depends. Again, you could use them. What he said, the magnetized activity that called in the spiritual force. That's what Iltar and his followers used it for. But
So they're activating them for ceremony?
Well, they have very special magnetic properties. In other words, I can communicate with the outer realms if I'm using them that way. But they also, we know how the Belial group uses them. They can be used. They have a deadly quality in the wrong hands. Okay. There's a piece about Emilius in here. I'm actually going to skip that part and go here.
Can I throw something in
to
there?
a thing about the Hall of Records? Yes. Oh, yeah.
So when I went to Damanhur,
Yes.
there was a whole chamber in the temple complex.
This is in
that
Italy,
were all
correct?
These, were all these. I'm trying to remember if they were orbs, but they were definitely crystals that were all set up. And I remember Sandy said, "Oh, this is where they interface with the aliens, basically."
Oh, interesting.
And I didn't know what she meant and how she knew that, but this makes sense to me now.
Wow, isn't that fascinating? There's so many strange things we hear about Damanhur over the years. All right, here's a little piece here talking about the Hall of Records. So Casey, again, is going into the past lives of these individuals, which is where all the Atlantean material comes from. So he is taking the person and tracking their individual lives through a reincarnation tract, bringing them back to this Atlantean part. That's where their subconscious is holding the memory of this. Quote, before that, we find the entity was in that land now known as the Egyptian during those periods when there were the buildings of the various tombs and buildings that were to stand as an example of memorial. The entity was among those that aided in the actual building of some of these temples that still remain, and in the preparation of that one as yet to be uncovered, the Hall of Records, where much may be brought to light. During those periods when the activities of those that were in other lands are shown in the earth, the entity may find much that was activated during that sojourn in the Egyptian land. So he goes on to talk about it. And then he says, before that, we find the entity was in the Atlantean land when there were preparation of those things that had pertained to the ability of the application of appliances to various elements known as electrical forces in the present day, as to the manners and ways in which various crafts carried individuals from place to place, and what may be known in the present as photographing from a distance, or the fields of activity that showed the ability of reading inscriptions through walls at a distance. Okay, so now we're looking at things through. It's thermography. And the preparations for the elevations and various activities where there was the overcoming of the forces of gravity itself. There's anti-gravity technology. Casey's nailing it right in there. And then he says, this was all done through the preparations of the crystal, the mighty, terrible crystal that made for the active principles in these. These were a portion of the activity of the entity in this experience. Much of it brought destruction, hence was not for the glorifying of God, who gave the ability or who made the activities in a material plane for the influences of higher forces and higher laws in nature itself. Hence, destructive forces and constructive forces were both in the influences of the entity known as Elam and that experience. Now, this is interesting. What he's saying is, through the application of the TUAOI stone, they were able to overcome gravity. Clearly there. But he's also emphasizing it started to be used in this negative fashion. And then he makes this very interesting reference to the crystal, mighty, terrible crystal. Why is it mighty and terrible? Well, there's only one other place in ancient literature where the term mighty, terrible crystal is used. And I'm going to read that for you now.
Can't wait. While you're finding that, New Jupiter says, I have spent many times in Guatemala. The pyramids will hum with each step in the scale.
Oh, wow.
These structures carry sound, vibration, and magic.
Wow. Isn't that fascinating? There's an interesting, there's two interesting things in the Bible. One has to do with Moses and another with Ezekiel that relate to this. And I'm going to read the Moses one first, and I'll save Ezekiel for last. Now, Moses is going up there to meet, God on the mountain, as it were. But there's an interesting little thing that gets slipped in here. that might give us a hint as to what's going on in relation to the stone and what the nature of the stone is, and how the TUAOI stone might be involved in this whole thing as well. Then Moses climbed up the mountain. There he saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there seemed to be a surface of brilliant blue lapis lazuli, as clear as the sky itself. And though those nobles of Israel gazed upon God, he did not destroy them. In fact, they ate a covenant meal, eating and drinking in his presence. And that was Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. So here's what's interesting, though. Again, when he goes up there, he looks down and he sees lapis. Well, it's very interesting because lapis comes up very heavily in terms of the TUAOI stone and the developments of stone, the Atlanteans going to this particular mine in Arizona. So there's a whole story about Casey going with Mitchell Hastings, who was the person who was instrumental in creating FM radio. And they take off down there and they go into these very interesting two towns. One of them is Bisbee, and the other one is Nogales. Now, it's very interesting because this town, how do you like the pronunciation of that?
That sounded pretty good.
Nogales is probably the correct terminology. Nogales, it's very interesting because everyone had assumed he had gone over the border into Mexico. But what I found is there's a border town right there. They each have their own Nogales. One is on the American side and one is on the Mexican side. So it's not very clear what the second one was that they went to. But when they went there, and this was all driven by these very unusual readings, they went into these unusual lapis mines to find the true lapis, the Atlantean lapis. And Casey tells this whole story about this 9,000-pound stone of lapis that was pulled out of this mine and brought to the Metropolitan Museum, and it became known as the singing stone because any time someone would get near it, they could hear the stone sing. And they also claimed these strange inspirations in the presence of the stone. So what happens is, because this gets out, word gets out, all these people start showing up looking for the stone. And the place, the museum starts to freak out, and they put the stone in a room that doesn't have any sun, and no one can hear the singing anymore. So there's a whole interesting track there about that singing stone. But in any case, they pull their own stones out of this very unusual mine. And while Casey goes into this mine, he starts to have all these very bizarre visions, ancient visions and things. But what's interesting is Hastings, who is with him, who's not psychic and is just a kind of a scientific engineer guy, he starts to see Casey's visions. So whatever it is, whatever the interaction is between those stones and the kind of super cosmic psychic ability, something very, very unusual is taking place that they're trying to give us a hint of. Now, I've got more on that tip, but we're out of time. On this front, we're going to go to your questions, and I'll smooth it in as among the questions. And you're up, Miss Olivia.
Joseph Tukas says it's the mother of all directed energy weapons. The terrible crystal. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting because this is how Casey said it was remembered. Because we can imagine if we had something which provided all this incredible power and then suddenly turned on us, very much like nuclear power or atomic power, but seemingly up a notch to a higher level even, because it was used for spiritual rituals and things of that nature as well. So we can see how it could be remembered just for the destructive aspects. And in fact, it came to be a dreaded memory of the crystal, which is why it only went into the hands of the initiates and all the technology went out, so that the culture after that starts to exist on a very low level. No planes, no flying machines, no UFOs, nothing, and they're not using the TUAOI stone for anything. You've gone back to a very primitive mode after the Great Destruction. There's no question about it. What do you got?
Blazing River, doesn't the Firestone Tire Company tie into this?
Yeah, I did a whole episode on that, and it's quite interesting because Firestone, one of the things that he created were these pyramids and incredible Egyptian imagery. But I'll tell you what's fascinating and kind of fits in along this line, which is Casey indicated that the Dodge group who created Dodge were Atlantean leaders in that period, and they had kind of come back to reassume this position. And this is the part of the wave that's going on with the Atlantean aspect, which is they're coming back in to do what they did then and face off against this incredible reality. But the problem is we are the Atlanteans, right? So we were there, and we faced off against this destruction, and here we are again. So the Atlanteans, according to Casey, are all exceptional. And not only did they have incredible technical abilities, they were all highly psychic. So they could get together in a group, this whole thing about raising stones, how did they do it, and all the rest of that. They could direct thought. So through those types of abilities, eventually they were, known as the greatest magicians of all time as well, having that type of strength over the physical realm. The problem is, too many of the opportunist types came in, the might makes right military aspect of the Sons of Belial, and that devastated the whole thing. Remember, the final story is that, the Sons of Belial won. They beat the Amelius group, in fact. But, the fruits of victory were ashes in their mouth because the whole thing went down. So this is part of the lesson. We've come back in here. And it was interesting because when Casey was looking at the different leaders who were in charge of World War II, from his psychic standpoint, he said they're all Atlanteans come back. So FDR, Hitler, all of them. And they were all facing off again in this kind of Atlantean Amelius versus Belial struggle. Yes.
Doc Roswell, DJ, are you familiar with the 2001 Disney Atlantis movie, which is openly admitted by writers to have been based on Casey's writings on Atlantis? It has the TUAOI stone as the central plot point.
Yes. Well, they have the Disney movie, and they ripped it off, from the Casey thing. I don't know if they admitted anything because they would have owed the ARE quite a lot of money. But I do think it's interesting, and of course, it's dramatically dumbed down. But there it is in the middle of that whole thing, this kind of weird energy source, this echo of the Casey story, as it were. I want to read a quick thing here about when Casey was working with this woman individually. He mentions the TUAOI stone, and he spells it out here, but this is actually kind of fascinating. And then we'll go right back to your questions. For this entity in the center, upon a board of paper, he's showing them how to draw a kind of life seal. We would begin with the stone as the light of the activities of the temple in the Atlantean Poseidian era. This might be termed the TUAOI stone, TUAOI. This would be a 6-facet stone of the height as to proportion with the rest of the chart. The stone of the TUAOI would be opalescent, while the light would be indicated from the top in the rays of the white light. Some foliage, as it might be indicated by the laurel, would be put about the base of the stone. In the foreground would be the pool of water, with the moon shining upon, saying, "Put the life force of the lotus as indicated in the lotus with its white and ruby center." This is some very interesting imagery that Casey's giving around the TUAOI stone. And there it is in its kind of super cosmic description. But the electrical description of the TUAOI stone, I think, is also interesting as a contrast. I'm going to read that now, and then we'll go back to your questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is TUAOI Atlantis Firestone Crystal in the HotZone. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch with each other around the incredible censorship that we've been witnessing here, which is pretty hardcore, and it's hopefully something we can get around in 2025. But with the
It doesn't look like it.
with the newsletter, the easiest way for us to keep in touch, because we can tell you about the exciting interviews that we have coming up, X series episodes that will blow your mind, and interviews. I have some very special interviews coming up for you. You won't believe, along with very special events, and of course the documentaries that we have coming up for you. Of course, our most recent documentary is JFK: The Final Speech, which is the Antarctica UFO file. That 90-minute presentation, which we released for the Kennedy anniversary, is available there for you. I've made it free. Of course, we have a docuseries that's available coming up later in the spring. That's all about the HotZone. And all of that is there in the newsletter. Make sure that you sign up and stand up and take notice and be counted. It's all there at darkjournalist.com. And what it means basically is once a week you'll get that fascinating update on everything that's happening and for anything that we're doing here on the Dark Journalist Show. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Roger Z, could it be that we all have a two-eyed stone? We have a left and a right eye, and in the center our own crystal, the pineal gland. Golgotha, from Hebrew, means Mount of the Skull. In our own human skull, we have two hemispheres. The Christ is the center of the three crosses on Golgotha.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird trick of history that it's called the two-eye stone. I mean, it has nothing to do with eyes, technically, and yet there's this overlay of two eyes. It's just how it sounds. But yeah, that is interesting. And
I love that interpretation.
I think the Golgotha thing about being the place of the skull is so very unusual. Remember, it's Steiner who says it's the mystery of Golgotha that provides the entire impulse for the 21st century. Okay, a little more on the two-eye stone. Going back to the Atlantean incarnation, what was the two-eye stone? Of what shape or form was it? It was in the form of a six-sided figure in which the light appeared as a means of communication between infinity and the finite, or the means whereby there were communications with those forces from the outside. Later, this came to mean that which from which the energies radiated, as to the center from which there were the radial activities guiding the various forces in transition of travel through the periods of the activity of the Atlanteans. It was set as a crystal, though in quite a different form from that used there. Do not confuse the two then, for there were many generations of difference. It was in those periods when there was the directing of airplanes or means of travel through which these in that time would travel in the air or on the water, under the water, just the same. Yet the force from which these were directed was in the central power station or two-eye stone, which was as the beam upon which it acted. In the beginning, it was the sources from which there was the spiritual and mental contact. Understand these are the following laws, if there would be the understanding or comprehension of these. For as has been given the basis, the beginning of law carries all the way through, and that which comes or begins first is conceived in spirit, grows in the mental, manifests in the material, as was this central force, two-eye, in the Atlantean experience. First, it was the means or manner by which the powers that be made the centralization for the making known to the children of God the directing forces of powers. Man eventually turned this into that channel for destructive forces and is growing towards that again here in the present, 1935. So he's getting the hint, just like you blew things up in Atlantis with the two-eye stone, humanity's doing it again. Let's be clear, And then what's interesting is someone talks about the idea, well, could I get into the Hall of Records and reconstruct the two-eye stone? And Casey says, yeah, but you could undo it just like you did then. So you have to be ready for this. But it's fascinating the way he puts that ability for us to access the Hall of Records and access the two-eye stone. It's not far off. We're obviously right in the zone of the period where this could happen. And that would be an incredible discovery, because I've put this on the record before, we've done so many shows on the UFO file, and I've signified the true importance of the UFO file, which is real, even if, the CIA disclosure is false. The UFO thing is absolutely true. And people have said, well, it would be the greatest discovery for humanity ever. It's not. No, it wouldn't be. Because the greatest disclosure would be that, we came through spiritually in Atlantis, developed an incredibly high civilization, and then blew it, and we're back to do the same thing. That's a much bigger realization, in my opinion. As is resurrection. I mean, resurrection would be the greatest story ever told, right? So the UFO aspect, the alien part, that we had peers out there in the universe, is a huge story. But the biggest story of humanity is that we were very advanced and on a spiritually psychic level far above the material plane at a certain point. So a lot of the things that we hear, about, oh, let's go to Mars and bring our consciousness to Mars. Look, unless you improve that consciousness here on Earth, there's no sense in bringing it to Mars. If you have wars and all this other stuff here, you're going to have them there too. So, that's why a lot of the Elon stuff is just claptrap, really. And we need to get our heads wrapped around that. A lot of the push that we're going to move somehow into space and that's going to save the light of consciousness and stuff. No, light of consciousness is right here, and it has nothing to do with space at all. What's interesting is the greater realization about space is our interface with it here.
Actually, the less that you do, the more still that you are.
True.
The more your consciousness expands. So
it is
like not leaving your home, not leaving your room.
Yes.
If you're bedridden and stuff, like that's actually the greatest opportunity in the world to raise your consciousness.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. I just think that space is being misused, and that we need to understand it in its concept, in its context, and kind of spiritualize it. Because to just take it, from this point of view of, oh, well, we messed up the Earth, so we're going to go to Mars, it's ridiculous. And I think that some of the things that they're selling on that level from SpaceX and all that are complete nonsense. It's a profit-driven environment, and the way that they've set up space is they've weaponized it, and they've kept it secret so that the public is paid for a secret space architecture environment. And we haven't got to see any of the benefits of it. And these companies come up and they're like, hey, we're privatizing space. Well, they privatized it with our money. And that's why, we haven't been back to the moon since 1972. So we need to get a little bit real about the rhetoric around some of these people and keep them in check, as it were. I do think I wanted to point this out, and it's kind of off track of this episode, but I will say this, that the recent fight over the H-1B visa and all the rest of it, regardless of what you think of that, Musk and his reaction and his attempt to kind of bully people on the Republican side to go his way on that, it proved to be such a liability that I think that's a signal right there to Trump. Not, he could bring down Trump's approval ratings dramatically just by being around and shooting his mouth off and just being stupid. So, and really being ignorant of how the political process works here. So there's a lot of problems there. As much as I think it was good for him to get behind Trump and all that, he's proving to be a liability when it comes. Yeah, he wrote the check, to help the campaign, but I would actually put him on the back burner dramatically if I were Trump. Trump is kind of riding high. He has a lot of things that he can accomplish here. He doesn't need to be thrown off by this guy who doesn't know the first rule of diplomacy, So I think that he could prove to be a liability if Trump's not careful. Yes.
Channeling the heart, Barbara Joyce. CERN is like the TUAOI stone. They are using it to create interdimensional portals and generate speeds higher than the speed of light, playing with electromagnetic fields, not knowing what they are doing.
Well, this is interesting, and this might be a good question for Barbara, which is, if you do any kind of healing with a crystal, so the way I understand it, and I'm sure you can answer this better too, but if you put that healing energy into the crystal, then somebody takes their hand and puts their hand on the crystal, they receive the healing, right? So the crystal is basically a conduit of that energy. So I guess that's kind of a very miniature version of what the TUAOI does. But
well, it's an amplifier, so it can cut both ways.
Yeah.
Right? So if you want to curse somebody, I mean, all you need to do is wear a crystal. Crystals pick up negative energy. That's why you have to clear them.
yes, yes, right. Okay, they're energetic towers. That's interesting. Here's one thing I know about the TUAOI stone, which is often Casey referred to it as the blue stone. And I'm thinking that the strain of crystal could be very important here, and that he's giving us hints there. And also that they would gather around and through the influence of the TUAOI crystal, bring through those messages from the outer spheres. So they could bring through the spiritual manifestations there through the crystal. There's something special there about the crystal. And what I find interesting is the interface over and over again. There's an interchange between lapis and the crystal. It's almost like sometimes when he's referring to the crystal, he's referring to lapis. Now, lapis is a copper ore. So I think there's a lot of questions there about how these things work and how they operate. But I do feel that people who can operate on a higher energetic level mentally with a psychic force somehow get an incredible boost by certain types of crystal. Yes.
I was just thinking, you know, they're doing a lot of research on copper wires, and Dom and her, that was a big part of their jewelry, was all this healing with copper wires.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, interesting.
Another link. I hadn't
Yes.
thought about them in a long time.
Well, I had a conversation with Gigi Young about copper. And, you know, I'll save that for our interview because we have an interview with her coming up. But boy, but she has some very interesting things to say about copper. I have a couple of rapid fire quotes here, and then we'll take your final couple of questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show X Series 183, TUAOI Atlantis Firestone Crystal in the Hot Zone. Whew. You're going deep, deep into the Hot Zone now, and you're beyond time and space as we speak. Here we go. All right, so there's a character back there in Egypt named Rata who is without a human father. And he interfaces with Hermes and all these other Atlantean leaders. And he brings the records there, and they have these mystical ceremonies to place the records. And there's another character there named Hefsut, Hepsuft, Supht. And so Casey is referring to these characters. Now, later we'll learn that Rata was actually an early incarnation of Casey, so keep that in mind. Then with the sealing of the activities of Hepsut and Rata and King Arat, there were the gatherings of the peoples and the record sealing with incense in the altars of the temple, and the altars were opened for their activities in the grounds about the temple of records. And many were there in the conditions, separated them from the associations of the lower kingdom that had been brought to those activities in all lands in the worship of Belial. This is interesting. So the Belial brought in all of these Atlantean automatons with them. They were slaves. And the Rata spiritual activity tried to, because they had mixed this human quality with this android quality and animal, they had done all these kind of genetic experiments. The Rata figure was trying to raise up the spiritual in these beings to free them from as Belial slaves, basically. The entity Hepsut, in the keeping of the records and the buildings that were put in their respective actions or places, this was the period 10,500 years before the entering of the Prince of Peace into the land of Egypt to study and become an initiate in and through the same activities that were set up by Hepsut in the dedication ceremony. So 10,500 years before Christ came into Egypt. Question: if the king's chamber is on the 50th course, on what course is the sealed Hall of Records? Answer: the sealed Hall of Records is in a different place, not in the Great Pyramid. That's important. Give me in detail what the sealed room, the Hall of Records, contains. A record of Atlantis from the beginning of those periods when the spirit took form and began the encasements in the land and the developments of the people throughout their sojourn, and the record of the first destruction and the changes that took place in the land and the nation of lands, and the record of meetings and the activities and the destructions that became necessary with the final destruction of Atlantis and the buildings of the pyramid of initiation, with who, what, where would come the opening of the records that are as copies from the sunken Atlantis. For with the change that's coming, it must, the temple, rise again. So the change, we're in the change here, and the temple is rising. And he's also saying, you know, the same people who placed it in there are going to open it. That I also find very interesting. And then he finishes it off this way. This in portion lies as the sun rises from the waters. The line of the shadow of light falls between the paw of the Sphinx that was later set as the sentinel or guard, which may not be entered from the connecting chambers from the Sphinx right paw until the time has been fulfilled when the changes are active in the sphere of human experience. So it's very interesting. The records are as the line of light falls between the paws of the Sphinx, and under the right paw is the connection, and somewhere between the Sphinx and the river, there's a hidden hall of records that contain the Atlantean records, which would completely revolutionize our version of history. But there's also a piece of that which is right off the coast of Bimini and again in Yucatan. So somehow those records will open simultaneously. And there have been efforts, I'm sure, behind the scenes by darker forces, like that whole thing about the Mubarak government and Zahi Hawass, who try to hijack, you know, the Casey work and get in on the Hall of Records. But I'm not sure that they have been able to do that. I doubt it, in fact. I think that it's still a mystery and a puzzle for them. But I do feel that the records and that whole piece is coming forward, and we have the ability maybe to, on a conscious level, apprehend that. And so it has to do then with the three records and the three places that it was kept. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Tim Houston says, Elvis had a bathtub made from lapis. That is so awesome.
Well, that was probably one of his big secrets right there.
Well, Elvis was secretly
yeah.
in the occult.
Oh,
Not
yeah,
so
yeah.
secretly.
No, it's incredible, actually. He, you know, what's weird is that he thought Blavatsky looked like his mother. Isn't that interesting? But he was terribly, terribly interested in psychic work, and he kept Isis Unveiled with him. He would tour with it. So he was very spiritually open. He wanted to know further answers. And of course, he spent time at the Self-Realization Institute, the SRF, that Yogananda had set up. He was a frequent visitor. Miss Olivia, the last two questions.
Yes. Let me do a little more than two.
Nope,
Okay.
two it is.
Ray Story, did water block the TUAOI stone's power like it does microwave, similar to the way you can't get TV reception underwater?
Well, I think there are references to water around it, but remember the original layout of Giza also is supposedly it was the pyramids, the Sphinx, and then all these waterways. So I think it was utilized, and no, I don't think it would block it, but I think the destruction, the TUAOI stone power grid setup that's over there in the HotZone in the Bermuda Triangle, and the reason that it messes everything up still is because it unleashed that whole kind of apotheum effect, and the reason it went and became so secret that these priesthoods would hold it and not let it out. You know, it was only in the hands of the initiates at the time, because they saw what happened when it just, you know, it just became the ability for the Belial group to dominate on such a level. I have an image. Let's see if I can find it here.
While you're looking for that,
Yeah.
Valerie Airy says Jodie Foster wears a lapis lazuli ring in the movie Contact.
Oh, isn't that
That is
interesting?
so cool.
Somebody was clued in, let me tell you. That's a wonderful shot of Polina Zalitsky in those caves, by the way, tying into that earlier reference that was going on. Yeah, why don't you give me one more question?
I'm gonna throw in here. Doc Roswell followed up. I asked if Atlantis was worth watching, and it's a big resounding yes. Says yeah, Atlantis is worth watching. They even show the firestones being used to power flying vehicles, and the opening scene of the film
Unbelievable.
shows the sinking being caused by a nuclear type weapon. The DVD extras is where the writers talk about being inspired by Casey.
Oh, interesting.
They
Okay.
know, with the writers in Hollywood,
Okay.
they know how to mine
Yeah.
all the occult literature and
Yes.
infuse it into their movies
I
and TV
found
shows.
it. I found it. You might have to look a little extra here, but you will see the serious tie over of the X-steganography in that image. And the X-steganography, again, referred to the advanced technology in the background and how the priests had to hold that information. That's where you get X-steganography. And then it's readopted in the 20th century by those very same groups now hoarding the UFO file. They start to use the X-steganography the same exact way. Yes, final question, Miss Olivia.
Well, I
you're
do
up.
want to throw this in here.
Okay.
Rebecca Romilay says Zalitsky's husband helped fundraise for a polar expedition where the studies included learning about the magnetism of the poles and measuring melatonin levels from the pineal gland.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, well, her husband is interesting. He's a writer as well. And her story, I think so much more of her story is going to come out. She is absolutely fascinating. And on record, in 2000, the year 2000, she discovered this incredible discovery. I think she may have even found it earlier. And I also think the idea that Castro, when he, says, hey, I want you to find these ruins for me, actually what he does under the cover there, he says, I want you to find Spanish galleons for me, which is kind of code word going on for those groups. I've got one last quote for you for the evening. And again, it's giving us that hint of what was happening at the very last destruction. And so here's Casey saying, in the Atlantean land, when there were the breaking up of the isles that had been given out, that those that were to be saved must journey to the various centers to which the leaders had been given the passports. The entity was among those that first came to what is now the Pyrenees and later to the activities that had been set up years before in the Egyptian land. In the Atlantean land during those periods when there was the activities that brought about the last destruction through the warring of the sons of the Law of One, the Amelius group, and the sons of Belial, among those who came to what is later the Yucatan land. And then finally, in Atlantean land, when there were those periods of the last upheavals and the disappearance of the island of Poseidia, that is right around Bimini, that whole area, among those who went to what later became the Inca land, the Peruvian land, as it is called in the present. Can you imagine that kind of destruction going on, and then you're fleeing to these different places looking for a new homeland, and you don't know what you're going to find, etc. And there are rumors that everything is going down and that these initiates are taking off to different corners of the earth, and you're trying to catch up and stay in that circuit. That is the nature of the destruction that Casey talks about from 10,500 BC that was happening. That group goes into Egypt, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the Amelius group sets up with Rata the entire Giza Plateau. They place the Hall of Records there, and somehow that is placed there for our benefit now. The question is, can humanity in the 21st century handle that? That's what the mystery schools put out there for us. And again, I think it happens one person at a time, and then it becomes sort of the subconscious register of all of us. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're done.
Okay.
Give it to me.
Okay.
How are your super chatters? Or unless you have
I'm
anything
getting them lined up right now.
anything else to add, you can.
Scott Koshland says, isn't it interesting that Columbus first landed in the Bahamas and then Cuba right near the HotZone? He must have been guided by the mystery schools, which had been going there for thousands of years.
Yeah, it is interesting. He also sees, he's like, oh, hey, there are all these floating candlesticks out here. What's going on? Yeah, well, those are some interesting craft descriptions there, Chris.
Okay. All right. Fan funding. Occult Fan, Pepe Le Pew Pew, Tim Houston, Descat Brock, Perez BJJ, Jonathan Kiner, Alarminine Bay, Mouth Breather Cure, Terry Doherty, Sarah Jane, Debbie McAdoo, The Bikini Truther, Mike Brosnahan, and Eurythmia's Fun again. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. Wow. We really appreciate your support, of course, and to all our subscribers. We couldn't do it without you. And with all the incredible things we have lined up for you, we hope that you'll be behind us for 2025 because we have some remarkable things to deliver for you. And with everything going on, I sense that that public wall of secrecy, it's fracturing in certain ways, and they're trying to spin that fracture so we don't get the full truth of it, which is where you see this whole drone swarm display, the different power struggles that are happening, and some of this kind of terrorist activity, or is it planned activity from the inside? Is it deep state terrorism? This is what I think we're looking at here, and it is so important for us, I think, in this period of time to have something, such an astute group there to work with in the HotZone, in the ideas room. And so I think that these things, again, come closer and closer together. And one of the things I've said about the censorship also is that I think they try to prevent exactly these types of conversations because, I'll put something out there and it'll ripple out in through the ideas room. And we may be a kind of a lone outpost on some of these things, but then you find those tentacles reaching into all these different areas. And you'd be quite surprised at the people who actually do watch the show. But, those things for me are very, very interesting. And I think it all starts here with the ideas and our exchange, that symbiosis, that kind of spark. And, there's really a lot of chemistry that takes place, I think, when you look at it that way. So I'll do a couple of shout outs here. You got something else?
No.
Okay. I thought I heard you laughing over there.
I will talk to you about it after the show.
Fantastic. Link to the Alex Jones show. Yeah, we hosted Alex, what was it, 2 weeks ago? I think it's 2 weeks ago. It's in the newsletter. If you want it, you're on that newsletter. And we'll be doing more with Alex in the futures. He's doing a lot of great reporting right now, and I think there's a lot to bring out with Alex and his own. He has a whole interesting side to him that's little explored, but he knows a great deal about things pertaining to the psychic level of things, and he knows a lot about the UFO file and the things that have been covered up there. And it's always a blast to do that. He's the architect of so much of the independent media, as we know. Jessica Rodriguez, it's great to see you out there. Happy New Year, everyone. Jonathan Kiner, Scarlet Fire. Who else we got here? Corey Anderson, Tim Houston. Tim got in there early. I think I looked at like 5 o'clock, and he was in there trading some facts. Classic music, I think he was talking about. Roger Z. Let's see. What else have we got? Thank you, sir.
Throw something out there?
Yes.
Fred Milton Olson III says, got a copy of Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, 1882. Hoping it's a good read. DJ has mentioned it several times. Are there particular Atlantis books that you would recommend? I mean, maybe for the beginner and maybe for the adept?
There's a series of books. I always recommend Edgar Cayce on Atlantis. I think it's from 1968, but it's so fundamental. It has the core. And then Mysteries of Atlantis Revisited was done by Edgar Evans, again, his son, who I got the chance to meet, which was fantastic. And he really was a very interesting person because here was this guy who was 92, I think, at the time I met him. And he looked 30 years younger. He followed the readings to a T. And the guy was just a powerhouse, you could tell. Al Qaeda, it's great to see you. Roger Z, terrific. So many people out there in the ideas room tonight. Gypsy Moon, Happy New Year to everyone, indeed. Scarlet Fire, more likes, please. Yes. Like, share, subscribe. Make sure you get behind the work that we're doing here on this program. Happy New Year, Archon. Thank you, sir. Very good to see you. Stay potent, DJ, indeed. The TUAOI Stone, we're going to have a lot of information about the TUAOI Stone going forward. So take a deep breath and keep walking forward. Happy New Year, says Najat. It's great to see you out there. Excellent. Mary Marlowe. Crypto Bits. Peace, human beings. I like that. Happy New Year, everyone. Gypsy Moon. Fantastic. What a great crew out there tonight. Jen Passivant, amazing show. Love me some lapis. Indeed. I'm going to start wearing lapis again. I used to. It's been quite a while. Alchemy by Angela. Fantastic. Love you all. Great to have you out there, Angela. And I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Pepe Le Pew, just some guy. Thank you, Pepe. And it was very generous of you earlier. Thank you, sir. We appreciate your support. El Kiter. All those images you're showing are the Mayan bat god Kamazot symbols of the underworld and death. Yeah, some of them are. The Birdman images come from the Spiro mound builders. So that's interesting. Scarlet Fire. We need 35 more likes. I like it. I'm right there with you. I'm telling you. Camelot will live again. Indeed. Got blocked out again. That's interesting. Yeah. Some people have said that on YouTube. I don't know how that rolls, but we've seen some of that. Karen Carpenter. Happy New Year, everyone. Feel better, Olivia Wings girl.
I'm on the mend.
Olivia sounded great. You sounded great tonight. Bravo. Nicely done.
Do the best I can.
Love to all, Scarlet Fire. Fantastic. Wow, what a great crew out there. Who else we got? Bella Clark, Esther Taylor. Wow, fantastic. Nick Malone. Isis Unveiled talks about Atlantis as well. Absolutely. No question about it. Blavatsky put so much of Atlantis on the record, fundamentally.
Jonathan McIntosh says slow mode tonight was an apotheum. I promise everybody, it's the last time we're going to do slow mode. We're not going to risk it again.
Plasma in the sky. Yeah. I think there's a lot there with plasma. I think it goes back to Reich's work, interestingly enough. But I think that there's a lot of overblowing plasma stuff too.
I don't know. I think it's about to explode our understanding of it.
It is, but I always there's a terrific balance in these things, and so I think that that's the challenge. But there's a tremendous amount for us to learn, and I think that the so much of the learning takes place in the sky. Those are the spirits of the air, the spirits of space, and so we certainly are headed in that direction. Olivia has it under control. Tina Boric, it's great to see you out there, Tina. Wow, fantastic. Hippie New Year, is that what it says? Hippie New Beer. I like it. You can't get better than that. I won't try to top that one. Everyone, it's fantastic to see you into the new year. We roll 2025, and what a great, huge crowd and a huge welcome for us. We will see you all next week. And we have an exciting show for you next week, some interviews coming up. And also, I'm going to do a special report. We get more information on this tragic incident involving this special forces guy and the Tesla explosion outside of the Trump Tower. Very unusual, I think, indeed. And
at some point, we're going to discuss the fog.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot coming in about that. Again, we'll have to see more details, but it sounds very much on that geoengineering tip. And I always refer people to the work of Ilana Freeland also on that. It's just extraordinary in her work. She's doing something now on synthetic biology. I don't know if that book is out yet, but I'm still working on the book that she just put out a year and a half ago. Just incredible work. And all of our guests, at times, just it's such a learning, enjoyable educational experience. It's great to have so many of you here. We will see you all next week. And, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends.
Never really ends. And
never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and, it could be. It just could be again. So have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Stay healthy.
That's a great, yes. That could be.
That if you could just do that this year, just make it through 2025 healthy as possible.
Stay potent and stay healthy. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
God bless.